music had barely started when Eleanor Whitfield felt the first cold glance slide past her, the way eyes always seemed to slide past her at every ball she attended. She stood near the tall windows of the Hartley townhouse, her pale blue gown a size too old for this year's fashion, and she watched the dancers turn beneath the candlelight, as if she were watching a painting rather than a room full of living people. No one asked her to dance, no one ever did. She had stopped minding, mostly. 3 seasons of standing near windows had taught her how to make herself small, how to smile at nothing, so that no one would notice she was truly alone. Her cousin Charlotte had promised to introduce her to a few respectable gentlemen tonight, but Charlotte had vanished an hour ago into a circle of laughing friends, and Eleanor had not seen her since. It did not matter. She had come only because her father insisted that a Whitfield must still be seen in society, even a Whitfield whose family fortune had nearly vanished. Appearances, he said, were sometimes all that stood between a family and complete ruin. Eleanor sipped her lemonade and let her gaze drift toward the terrace doors, where the night air looked cooler and far more honest than the room behind her. She was halfway across the floor, weaving carefully between silk skirts and polished boots, when she collided with a wall of dark blue wool. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping back. The man she had walked into did not answer at first. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes the color of a winter sky, and he wore his evening coat the way some men wore armor, as if daring anyone to come near him. Eleanor did not recognize him, which was strange because every face in this room belonged to someone she had been forced to memorize over 3 long seasons. "You should watch where you walk," he said, his voice low and clipped. "I did watch," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "You were simply standing in a doorway meant for walking through." Something flickered across his face, something that might have been surprise, though it was gone before she could be certain. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "No," Eleanor admitted honestly. "Should I?" A muscle moved in his jaw. Most people in this room seemed to think so. Eleanor glanced past him toward the crowd, where several young ladies were watching their exchange with open curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands. She looked back at him, at the way his shoulders were drawn tight, the way his expression had already hardened into something distant and unwelcoming. "I am sure they are right to think so," she said simply. "But I have not had the pleasure of an introduction, and I find it difficult to be impressed by a stranger, however important he believes himself to be." For a long moment he only stared at her, and Eleanor wondered if she had said something unforgivable. She had a habit of speaking before she considered the consequences, a habit her father often scolded her for, though her mother, before she passed, had always said it was one of Eleanor's better qualities. "You are either very brave or very foolish," the man finally said. "Perhaps I am simply tired," Eleanor replied. It has been a long evening of being invisible. Bumping into someone was almost refreshing. She had meant it as a small joke, a way to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment, but the man's expression shifted again, harder this time, as though she had struck a nerve she did not know existed. "Invisible," he repeated, with something bitter in his tone. "How fortunate for you. I would trade places with you gladly." Eleanor blinked, uncertain how to respond to that. "I doubt that very much, sir. Being unseen is not as pleasant as you imagine, and being watched every moment, judged for every word, hunted by every mother with an unmarried daughter, is not as pleasant as you imagine either," he snapped. His voice had risen slightly, enough that a few heads turned nearby. He seemed to notice this and lowered his tone, though the edge remained. "You want to know what I recommend, since you seem so fond of honesty. Ignore me. Ignore me like everyone else in this room pretends they do not want to. It would save us both a great deal of trouble." Eleanor studied him for a moment. Beneath the sharpness of his words, she thought she saw something else, something tired and lonely that he was working very hard to hide. She had seen that look before, in her own mirror, on the nights when her father's coughing kept her awake and she wondered how much longer they could hold their small household together. Instead of retreating, as she suspected he expected her to, Eleanor smiled. It was not a large smile, nor a flirtatious one. It was simply warm, and a little amused, the kind of smile one might give an old friend who had said something absurd. "Very well," she said. "I shall ignore you completely, starting now." Then she stepped around him and continued toward the terrace doors, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the ballroom floor. She did not look back to see his reaction. If she had, she would have seen him staring after her, his brows drawn together in genuine confusion, as though she had spoken a foreign language he could not quite translate. Out on the terrace, the night air was cool against her skin, and Eleanor breathed it in gratefully. Below the stone balustrade, the garden stretched out in careful rows of hedges and roses, silver under the moonlight. She rested her hands on the cold stone and let herself simply exist for a moment, away from the noise and the watching eyes. "There you are." Charlotte appeared at her side, breathless and glowing from dancing. "I have been looking everywhere. Did you dance with anyone?" "No," Eleanor said. "But I did have quite an interesting conversation." "With whom?" Eleanor hesitated, realizing she did not actually know the man's name. "A tall gentleman, dark hair, rather severe manners. He told me to ignore him." Charlotte's eyes widened so quickly that Eleanor almost laughed. "Severe manners? Dark hair? And he told you to ignore him? Eleanor, that could only be the Duke of Rothmere." "The Duke?" Eleanor felt a small jolt of surprise, though she tried not to show it. She had heard the name whispered all evening, always with a mixture of awe and caution, but she had never seen the man attached to it, not until tonight. "Julian Ashford," Charlotte said, lowering her voice as though the name itself carried weight. "He inherited the title 2 years ago, and since then he has refused every match his relations have tried to arrange. They say he is cold as ice, that his heart froze the day his engagement ended. No one dares approach him unless they want to be humiliated in front of the entire room." "He did seem rather guarded," Eleanor admitted. "Guarded? Eleanor, half the women here would faint if he so much as looked their way. And you are telling me you simply walked off and left him standing there?" "He asked to be ignored," Eleanor said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I thought it only polite to grant his wish." Charlotte stared at her for a long moment, then burst into quiet laughter, covering her mouth with her gloved hand. "Only you, Eleanor Whitfield. Only you would take the Duke of Rothmere at his word, and actually walk away." Eleanor turned back toward the garden, watching the shadows shift beneath the hedges. She told herself it did not matter, that she would likely never speak to the Duke again, that men like him did not concern themselves with women like her, women whose families were one bad season away from losing everything they had left. And yet, as she stood there in the cool night air, she found herself thinking about the flicker of surprise that had crossed his face, the way his sharp words had faltered when she smiled instead of retreating. It had felt, for just a moment, as though she had seen something true beneath all that ice. Inside the ballroom, Julian Ashford stood near a marble column, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, watching the terrace doors where the strange young woman had disappeared. He did not know her name. He had not thought to ask. In 2 years of guarding himself against every calculating smile and every rehearsed laugh, he had grown accustomed to reading intention in every glance sent his way, and yet he could not read what he had seen in hers. She had not flattered him. She had not lowered her eyes or blushed or angled herself to appear more appealing. She had simply looked at him as though he were an ordinary, somewhat rude man who happened to be blocking a doorway, and then she had smiled and walked away, exactly as he had told her to. No one walked away from him, not since he had become the Duke, not since the last time he had trusted someone enough to let his guard down, and had paid for it with a wound that still had not fully closed. Rothmere. Lord Callahan appeared at his elbow, a knowing smirk on his face. "I saw you speaking with Miss Whitfield. Careful there. Her family's fortune has nearly run dry, I hear. Wouldn't want anyone thinking you'd taken pity on a charity case." Julian's jaw tightened. "I was not aware her family's circumstances were any concern of mine." "No, of course not," Callahan said, though his smirk did not fade. "Still, it isn't like you to speak to anyone at these things, let alone a woman with no fortune and no particular beauty to recommend her." Julian said nothing, though something in Callahan's careless dismissal of her irritated him more than he expected. He set down his wineglass and left the conversation without another word, moving toward the terrace doors himself, though he stopped just short of stepping through them. Through the glass he could see her standing at the balustrade, her dark hair catching the moonlight, her posture calm and unbothered in a way that seemed almost impossible for anyone at a gathering like this. She had called herself invisible. Perhaps she was, to everyone else in that room. Julian found that he did not want to look away. He turned from the door before she could catch him watching, and made his way back into the crowded ballroom, telling himself firmly that this was nothing, that she was nothing, that he had a household to run and a title to protect, and no time to waste wondering about a woman whose name he did not even know. But later that night, long after the carriages had rolled away from the Hartley townhouse and the candles had burned low, Julian sat alone in his study, staring into the dying fire, and found that he could not stop thinking of the way she had smiled at him, as though his sharpness had not frightened her at all. For the first time in 2 years, the silence of his own house felt too heavy to bear. The bookshop on Marlow Street smelled of leather and old paper, and it was one of the few places in London where Eleanor Whitfield felt entirely herself. She came here whenever her father's condition allowed her a free afternoon, browsing the shelves without any pressure to smile at strangers or pretend interest in conversations that led nowhere. She was reaching for a worn copy of a novel on the highest shelf when a hand appeared beside hers and pulled it down instead. "Allow me," said a voice she recognized immediately. Eleanor turned and found herself face to face with the Duke of Rothmere, the book held out toward her, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," she said, taking the book carefully. "I did not expect to see you here." "I could say the same," Julian replied, "though I suspect neither of us is entirely surprised." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to amusement. "Are you suggesting you came to this shop hoping to find me, Your Grace?" "I am suggesting no such thing," he said quickly, though the faint color that touched his own face told a different story. "I have business on this street. The bookshop was merely convenient." "Of course," Eleanor said, not bothering to hide her smile. "Convenient." They stood there for a moment, neither quite willing to end the conversation nor certain how to continue it. Around them, the shop's other patrons moved quietly between the shelves, unaware that anything unusual was taking place. "I did not learn your name," Julian said finally. "At the ball, I left before I thought to ask." "You did not leave, Your Grace." "I did. You were the one who asked to be ignored, if I recall correctly. And yet here we are, having a conversation." "I suppose old habits are difficult to break," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Whitfield." "Julian Ashford," he replied, though they both knew the title that came before his name. "Though I understand you already knew that, from your cousin's reaction." "Charlotte does have a talent for gossip," Eleanor admitted. "She was quite scandalized that I did not immediately faint at your feet." "A relief, then, that you did not," Julian said. "I find fainting women rather tiresome." "How fortunate that I am neither tiresome nor prone to fainting." There was something easy about the exchange, something that surprised them both. Julian could not remember the last time he had spoken with anyone, man or woman, without calculating the angles of their intentions, without wondering what they wanted from his title or his fortune. Eleanor spoke to him as though he were simply a man standing in a bookshop, mildly irritating and occasionally amusing, nothing more. "What were you looking for?" he asked, nodding toward the shelf. "Something to distract my father," Eleanor said. "He has been unwell, and reading aloud in the evenings helps him rest." "I am sorry to hear he is unwell." "Thank you." Eleanor turned the book over in her hands, tracing the worn spine with her thumb. "It has been difficult these past months. But we manage." Julian studied her for a moment, noting the careful way she spoke, as though choosing each word to avoid revealing too much. He recognized the instinct, having spent years perfecting it himself. "And what of you, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked, turning the conversation away from herself. What business could possibly bring a duke to a street of booksellers and tailors? "I own several properties nearby," Julian said. "I was inspecting one of them. The bookshop, as I said, was convenient." "You keep saying convenient as though it explains everything. Does it not?" "No," Eleanor said, tilting her head slightly. "I think you wanted an excuse to be somewhere ordinary, somewhere no one would watch you and calculate your worth in pounds and titles. I think, Your Grace, that you are rather tired of being important." Julian went very still. It was not the first time someone had guessed at his exhaustion, but it was the first time anyone had said it so plainly, without flattery or pity attached to the observation. "You are very direct, Miss Whitfield." "I have found that directness saves a great deal of time," Eleanor said, "though I understand it is not always welcome in polite company." "It is welcome with me," Julian said, surprising himself with the honesty of the admission. "I have grown weary of people who say one thing and mean another. It becomes difficult to know who is being honest, and who is simply performing honesty for effect." "And which am I doing now?" "I have not yet decided," Julian admitted, "though I find myself inclined to believe you." They walked together through the narrow aisles of the shop, no longer discussing anything of consequence, simply exchanging opinions on books they had read and stories they had loved as children. Eleanor found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, and Julian found himself listening more closely than he had allowed himself to listen to anyone in years. When they finally stepped outside onto the busy street, the afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. "I should return home," Eleanor said. "My father will worry if I am gone too long." "Of course." Julian hesitated, then added, "Might I call upon you, to inquire after your father's health, if nothing else?" Eleanor considered him for a moment, weighing the offer against everything Charlotte had warned her about, against every whisper she had heard regarding the Duke's cold reputation and guarded heart. "You may call," she said finally, "though I warn you, our house is small, and our tea is often weak. We are not accustomed to entertaining dukes." "I do not require grand entertainment," Julian said. "I require honest conversation." You seem to have an abundance of that. Eleanor smiled and inclined her head before turning to walk down the street toward home, and Julian stood watching her go, the book he had pulled down from the shelf still resting forgotten in his own hands. That evening, Eleanor sat beside her father's bed, reading aloud from the novel she had purchased, though her mind kept drifting back to the bookshop, to the unexpected ease of their conversation. "You seem distracted tonight," her father said, his voice weaker than it had been the week before, though his eyes remained sharp and attentive. "Something on your mind, my dear?" "Nothing important," Eleanor said, though the small smile she could not quite suppress told a different story. "You have your mother's smile when you are keeping secrets," he said, chuckling softly, though the laugh turned into a cough that lasted longer than Eleanor liked. She reached for the glass of water on the bedside table and helped him drink, her worry momentarily eclipsing every other thought. "I am fine," he insisted, once the coughing subsided. "Do not fuss over me so." "Someone must," Eleanor said gently, "since you refuse to fuss over yourself." Her father's illness had worsened steadily over the past several months, the physicians offering little comfort and even less certainty. The medicines cost more than the household could easily afford, and Eleanor had watched their small savings dwindle with a growing sense of dread she tried carefully to hide from him. Her cousin's family had offered, more than once, to introduce her to eligible gentlemen who might secure their financial future through marriage, but Eleanor had resisted, unwilling to enter a union built on nothing but necessity. She wanted, foolishly perhaps, something more than a transaction dressed up in wedding lace. She thought of Julian Ashford, of his sharp words and unexpected warmth, and told herself firmly that whatever she felt was nothing more than curiosity, a passing fascination that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. Dukes did not marry women whose families teetered on the edge of ruin, no matter how honest their conversations in bookshops might be. Still, when she finally extinguished her candle that night and settled into bed, she found herself smiling into the darkness, thinking of a man who had asked to be ignored, and had instead found himself remembered. 2 days later, a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest stopped outside the Whitfield home, and Eleanor watched from the window as Julian Ashford stepped down and approached the front door, exactly as he had promised he would. She smoothed her plain gray dress, took a steadying breath, and went to answer the door herself, since their household could no longer afford to keep a proper servant for such tasks. "Your Grace," she said, opening the door, "I did not expect you so soon." "I told you I would call," Julian said. "I do not make promises I have no intention of keeping." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, aware of how small and worn their sitting room must appear compared to the grand houses he was accustomed to visiting. If Julian noticed the faded curtains or the threadbare rug, he gave no indication of it, his attention fixed entirely on her. "My father is resting," she said, "but I am certain he would enjoy a visit, if you are willing to sit with someone who has little strength for lengthy conversation." "I am in no hurry," Julian said. "Lead the way, Miss Whitfield." That first visit lasted only half an hour, for her father tired easily, but Julian returned 3 days later, and then again the following week, until his visits became something Eleanor found herself watching for from the window, though she never admitted this aloud to anyone, not even Charlotte. On one such afternoon, when her father was sleeping soundly and the weather had turned unexpectedly mild, Julian suggested they walk together in the small public garden 2 streets from her home, rather than sit inside the stuffy parlor. "I did not take you for a man who enjoys gardens," Eleanor said, tying the ribbons of her bonnet as they stepped outside. "I do not, particularly," Julian admitted. "But I find I enjoy walking beside you more than I enjoy sitting across from you in silence, waiting for your father to wake. That is oddly honest of you." "I have found honesty easier in your company than anywhere else," he said. "I am not certain why." They walked slowly along the gravel path, past rows of late-blooming roses and a small fountain where 2 children chased each other around the stone basin, laughing loudly enough to draw a rare, unguarded smile from Julian's face. "Tell me something true," Eleanor said. "Something you would not tell anyone at a ball." Julian was quiet for a moment, considering. "I was engaged once, 2 years ago. Her name does not matter now. She agreed to marry me before my father died and I inherited the title, and after the funeral, when the settlement papers were being drawn, I overheard her speaking to her mother about the wealth she would soon control. She spoke of my grief as though it were merely a convenient delay." "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly. "Do not be. It taught me something valuable, however painfully it was learned. It taught me that most people who smile at a duke are smiling at the title, not the man beneath it." He glanced sideways at her. "You did not know I was a duke when you first spoke to me." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I only knew you were rude." A short laugh escaped him, surprising them both. You have a talent for humbling me, Miss Whitfield. Someone ought to, Eleanor said. I imagine very few people dare to try. Very few, he agreed. You are the first in a long while. They continued walking, the conversation drifting between lighter subjects, though the honesty of what he had shared lingered between them, a small thread pulling them closer without either fully acknowledging it. Your turn, Julian said eventually. Tell me something true. Eleanor considered for a moment, then spoke quietly. I am frightened most days, though I try not to show it. My father grows weaker, our accounts grow thinner, and I do not know how much longer we can continue as we are. My aunt has suggested, more than once, that I ought to marry a merchant she knows, a kind enough man, but one I feel nothing for beyond simple gratitude. And will you? I do not know, Eleanor admitted. I have always hoped for something more than gratitude in a marriage, though I am beginning to understand that hope is a luxury my family may no longer afford. Julian said nothing for a long moment, though something in his expression had shifted, a tightness around his eyes that Eleanor could not quite interpret. You deserve more than gratitude, he said finally. Whatever else is true, you deserve that much. Careful, Your Grace, Eleanor said, attempting to lighten the sudden weight of the conversation. You are beginning to sound almost kind. I have my moments, Julian said, and though his tone remained dry, there was warmth beneath it now. Warmth that had not been present in the ballroom weeks before. They returned to her home as the afternoon light began to fade, and Julian took his leave with a small bow, promising to call again the following week. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the street and stood in the doorway longer than necessary, turning over everything he had told her, everything she had told him in return. And so began a habit neither of them had planned, an easy rhythm of visits and conversations that stretched across the following weeks, each one drawing them closer despite every reason they both knew existed to stay apart. The garden party at Lord Averley's estate was meant to be a pleasant affair, a gathering of the season's remaining families before the summer drew to a close. But Eleanor felt uneasy the moment she stepped through the gates. Too many eyes turned toward her. Too many whispered conversations paused as she passed, and she could not shake the sense that something had changed since the last time she had walked into a room full of these particular people. You look lovely today, Charlotte said, looping her arm through Eleanor's as they walked along the stone path toward the refreshment tables. Though I confess, half the ladies here have been talking of nothing but you and the Duke for the past week. There is nothing to talk about, Eleanor said, though her stomach tightened at the words. We are merely acquainted. Acquainted men do not visit a woman's home 4 times in a fortnight, Charlotte said, raising an eyebrow. Nor do they walk with her in public gardens for hours at a time. People have noticed, Eleanor. People always notice these things. Eleanor said nothing, though she knew Charlotte was right. She had told herself, over and over, that her friendship with Julian meant nothing beyond simple companionship, that a duke and a woman with a fading fortune could never be more to each other than passing acquaintances. But she had not been entirely honest with herself, not for weeks now, and the growing warmth she felt whenever his carriage appeared outside her home had become impossible to ignore. They found a quiet corner near the rose hedges, away from the largest crowds, and Eleanor allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to enjoy the afternoon sunlight without the weight of watching eyes. That peace did not last long. Miss Whitfield, the voice belonged to Lady Priscilla Hartwell, a woman Eleanor had encountered several times before, always with the same cold politeness that barely concealed her disdain. She approached with 2 other young ladies flanking her, their expressions carrying the particular cruelty of people who had never known real hardship. How surprising to see you here. I would have thought your family's circumstances might keep you occupied elsewhere. My family's circumstances are our own concern, Lady Priscilla, Eleanor replied evenly, though she felt her cheeks warm. Of course, of course. Priscilla's smile did not reach her eyes, though I must say, it is rather clever of you, setting your sights on the Duke of Rothmere. A woman in your position could hardly hope for a better solution to her family's difficulties. I only wonder if His Grace realizes quite how convenient a match you would make. The words landed like small blows, each one calculated to wound. Around them, several other guests had drawn closer, drawn by the promise of a scene, their conversations quieting to listen. I have not set my sights on anyone, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The Duke and I are friends, nothing more. Friends, Priscilla repeated, exchanging an amused glance with her companions. How charming. Tell me, Miss Whitfield, does a woman with no dowry to speak of often find dukes so eager for friendship? Or is there perhaps another explanation, one involving your family's rather desperate need for funds? Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and Eleanor felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear into herself the way she had learned to do at countless gatherings before this one. But something had changed in her these past weeks, some quiet strength she had not fully recognized until this moment. "I am sorry that my presence here troubles you so deeply, Lady Priscilla," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. "Though I confess I do not understand why my circumstances concern you at all, unless perhaps you find yourself envious of a friendship you were never offered." A few gasps sounded from the crowd, and Priscilla's face flushed with anger, her composure cracking for just a moment before she forced her smile back into place. "How dare you?" "That is quite enough." The voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and commanding, and every head turned toward the source. Julian Ashford stood at the edge of the gathering, his expression carved from ice, his eyes fixed on Lady Priscilla with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Your Grace," Priscilla stammered, "I did not mean—" "I heard precisely what you meant," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have spent the last several minutes humiliating a woman whose only offense was standing near you at a garden party. I find that behavior beneath contempt, Lady Priscilla, and I would advise you to reconsider such conduct in the future, particularly if you wish to remain welcome in circles where I am also present." The threat, though carefully worded, was unmistakable. Priscilla's face drained of color, and her companions took a hurried step away from her, as though her humiliation might somehow prove contagious. "Forgive me, Miss Whitfield," Priscilla managed, her voice barely audible now. "I spoke without thinking." Eleanor said nothing, too stunned by the sudden shift in circumstances to form a proper reply, and Priscilla, taking the silence as dismissal, hurried away with her companions trailing behind her, leaving a thick and awkward silence in their wake. The gathered crowd dispersed slowly, whispering amongst themselves, though now their whispers carried a different tone entirely, one of surprise and speculation about what they had just witnessed. "You did not need to do that," Eleanor said quietly, once they were finally alone near the hedges. "I could have managed on my own." "I know you could have," Julian said. "I saw how you managed before I arrived. You handled her far better than she deserved, but I would not stand by and watch someone speak to you that way, regardless of whether you needed my help." "Everyone will talk now," Eleanor said. "About us. About what this means." "Let them talk," Julian said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely as unbothered as he wished to appear. "I have spent 2 years letting other people's opinions dictate how I live. I find I am growing tired of it." Eleanor studied his face, searching for some sign of regret, some indication that he already wished to take back what he had done. She found none. Instead, she found something steady and certain, something that made her heart beat a little faster despite every warning her mind offered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for defending me." "You do not need to thank me," Julian said. "You deserved better than what she offered you, and I could not simply watch it happen." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the noise of the party fading into the background, until Julian offered his arm and suggested they walk toward the far side of the gardens, away from the curious eyes still lingering near the refreshment tables. As they walked, Eleanor found herself thinking of everything Priscilla had said, the accusations of convenience and calculation, and though she knew the words to be cruel and unfounded, a small worry took root in her chest regardless. What if others believed the same? What if Julian himself began to wonder whether her affection for him carried some hidden motive? "You have grown quiet," Julian observed, glancing sideways at her. "I am only thinking," Eleanor said, "about what she said, about how it must look, to others, a duke spending so much time with a woman whose family has so little left." "I do not concern myself with how things look," Julian said. "I concern myself with what is true, and what is true is that I have not felt this at ease in another person's company in longer than I care to admit." Eleanor smiled despite herself, though the worry did not entirely fade. "You say such things so easily, Your Grace." "Only to you," he said. "I find myself entirely unable to guard my words when I am with you, which I confess troubles me somewhat, given how carefully I have guarded them with everyone else." They reached a quiet bench beneath a large oak tree, and Julian gestured for her to sit, settling beside her with a comfortable distance between them, though neither seemed particularly eager to maintain it. "May I tell you something?" Julian asked, his voice quieter now, more hesitant than she had ever heard it. "Of course. I have been thinking of you constantly these past weeks, not merely during our visits but in the quiet hours afterward, when I return home and find myself replaying our conversations, wishing I had said something differently, or wondering what you might have thought of some passing observation I did not have the chance to share." He paused, studying his own hands. I do not entirely know what to make of these thoughts, given everything I promised myself after my engagement ended. What did you promise yourself? Eleanor asked softly. That I would never again allow myself to be so thoroughly unguarded with another person. That I would protect myself from the kind of disappointment that comes from trusting someone who does not deserve it. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. And yet here I am, having broken that promise entirely, without quite understanding how it happened. Eleanor's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his words, at the vulnerability he had never shown her before, not even during their walk in the garden weeks earlier. She wanted, desperately, to offer him some reassurance, some promise that her affection carried no hidden motive, but she understood that words alone would not be enough to erase 2 years of guarded suspicion. I cannot promise you that trusting me will never disappoint you, she said carefully. No one can promise such a thing. But I can promise that whatever I feel for you has nothing to do with your title or your fortune. I would feel the same, I think, if you were simply Julian Ashford, a man with no estate and no name worth mentioning. I believe you, said quietly, which frightens me more than I expected it to. They sat together beneath the oak tree as the afternoon light softened into evening, saying little more, though the silence between them carried a weight neither of them wished to disturb. Somewhere behind them, the party continued, laughter and music drifting across the gardens, but for the moment, neither Eleanor nor Julian felt any particular urge to return to it. Later, as Julian's carriage carried Eleanor home through the darkening streets, she found herself replaying every word of their conversation, turning over the fear she had heard in his voice, the fear that mirrored her own. She did not know what would come of this growing bond between them, whether society would ever accept a match so far outside its expectations. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she no longer wished to pretend her feelings were merely simple friendship. Whatever waited for them ahead, she thought, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood come into view, she would rather face it honestly than continue hiding behind careful words and polite distance. Before she reached her own front door, Eleanor found her aunt waiting for her in the small sitting room, a cup of cold tea untouched on the table beside her, her expression carrying the particular tightness that always preceded an unwelcome conversation. You were seen with the Duke again, her aunt said without preamble. Word travels quickly, Eleanor, and not always kindly. We are friends, Aunt Margaret, Eleanor said, removing her bonnet and setting it aside with more care than the moment required, if only to avoid meeting her aunt's eyes directly. Nothing more has passed between us. Friends, her aunt repeated, echoing Lady Priscilla's earlier scorn so precisely that Eleanor felt a fresh wave of exhaustion settle over her. Eleanor, I say this with love, but you cannot afford the luxury of friendship with a man so far above your station, not when Mr. Colton has expressed genuine interest in a match, and not when your father's health continues to decline with every passing week. Eleanor sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. Mr. Colton is a kind man, I do not deny it, but I feel nothing for him beyond simple respect, and I do not think that respect alone is sufficient foundation for a marriage. Respect has built stronger marriages than passion ever has, her aunt said, not unkindly, though the words carried the weight of hard experience. Your father cannot continue much longer without proper care, Eleanor. The physicians grow more expensive with each visit, and our accounts grow thinner with each passing month. I do not say this to frighten you, only to remind you of what is truly at stake. I am aware of what is at stake, Eleanor said quietly. I think of little else most days. Her aunt's expression softened slightly, and she reached across the small distance between them to squeeze Eleanor's hand. I know you are, my dear. I only worry that this friendship with the Duke, however genuine it may feel, will end in heartbreak rather than security. Men of his station rarely marry women of ours, whatever affection may pass between them in private gardens. The words lingered long after her aunt had retired for the evening, following Eleanor up the narrow staircase and into her small bedroom, where she sat by the window and watched the last light fade from the sky. She knew her aunt spoke from genuine concern rather than cruelty, and she knew, too, that the concern was not entirely misplaced. She had heard countless stories of women who had allowed themselves to hope for more than society permitted, only to find their hearts broken and their reputations damaged beyond repair. And yet, when she closed her eyes and thought of Julian's voice beneath the oak tree, the honesty in his admission that he could not guard his words around her, she found it impossible to regret the growing bond between them, whatever risks it carried. She rose early the next morning to sit with her father, who seemed a little stronger than he had been in recent days, his eyes bright as she read to him from the novel she had purchased weeks earlier. You have not mentioned the Duke in several days, her father observed, once she had paused to turn a page. Charlotte tells me he visits rather frequently. Aunt Margaret has already spoken to me about it, Eleanor said, a small sigh escaping her. I did not think you paid attention to such gossip, father. I pay attention to my daughter's happiness, he said gently. And I have not seen you smile so often in a very long while, not since before your mother passed. Whatever concerns your aunt carries about propriety and station, I find myself far more concerned with whether this man treats you with the kindness and respect you deserve. He does, Eleanor said softly, surprised by how quickly the answer came to her. He is nothing like I expected. When I first met him, beneath all his sharpness, there is a great deal of gentleness, though I think he has spent years hiding it from everyone, including himself. Her father studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful despite the fatigue evident in his features. Then let him show it, my dear, whatever your aunt fears about the difference in your stations. I would rather see you happy with a man who values your honesty than secure with one who values only your convenience. Eleanor took his hand and held it gently, grateful beyond words for his understanding, even as worry continued to gnaw at the edges of her heart. Whatever comfort her father's words provided, she could not entirely silence the fear that Lady Priscilla's cruel accusations might yet prove prophetic, that society's judgment might eventually prove too heavy a weight for even the sturdiest affection to bear. That night, after Eleanor had gone inside and the carriage had rolled away into the darkness, Julian sat alone in his study once more, though this time the silence of his house did not feel nearly as heavy as it once had. He thought of Priscilla's cruel words, of the calculating glances he had grown so accustomed to receiving from society, and he thought, too, of Eleanor's steady gaze, the complete absence of pretense in everything she said and did. He had spent 2 years building walls around himself, convinced that vulnerability led only to betrayal. But sitting there, replaying the honesty of their conversation beneath the oak tree, Julian found himself wondering, for the first time since his engagement had ended, whether those walls had protected him from anything worth avoiding at all, or whether they had simply kept him from something worth having. Julian stood before the window of his study, watching rain streak down the glass, a letter from his solicitor forgotten on the desk behind him. He had read it 3 times already, the details of a small debt attached to the Whitfield estate, one that threatened to result in the loss of their modest home if left unpaid much longer. He had not gone looking for this information. It had come to him instead, through the careful inquiries he had made after their conversation beneath the oak tree. Inquiries he told himself were born of simple concern rather than something deeper. He knew what he intended to do, and he knew, too, that Eleanor would likely refuse the gesture if he offered it openly. She had made her pride clear enough over their weeks of conversation, her insistence that she wanted nothing from him beyond honest friendship, no matter how difficult her family's circumstances became. And so he decided, after much deliberation, that she need never know the money had come from him at all. Through his solicitor, arranged with careful discretion, the debt was settled within the week, listed only as an anonymous payment from a distant relation who wished to remain unnamed. Julian told himself this was the right decision, the only decision that respected both her pride and her family's desperate need, though a small voice in the back of his mind warned him that secrets, however well-intentioned, rarely remained buried forever. He did not mention it during his next visit to the Whitfield home, sitting instead in the familiar parlor while Eleanor read aloud to her father, who seemed brighter than he had in weeks, his relief at the sudden lifting of financial pressure evident in every unguarded smile. "You seem happier today," Julian observed, once her father had drifted into a comfortable sleep and they had stepped into the small garden behind the house. "We received wonderful news," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with an emotion Julian recognized immediately as relief. A debt that had been troubling us for months was suddenly settled, paid entirely by some distant relation neither my father nor I can quite identify. It feels almost like a miracle. Julian kept his expression carefully neutral, though guilt tightened uncomfortably in his chest at the deception, however well meant it had been. "That is wonderful news indeed. Your father must be greatly relieved." "He is," Eleanor said, "though I confess I find the mystery rather unsettling. We have no relations wealthy enough to make such a payment, nor any who would do so without wanting recognition for their generosity. Perhaps some gestures are made without any desire for recognition at all," Julian said carefully. Eleanor glanced at him, something shifting in her expression, a flicker of suspicion that made his stomach tighten with unease. "You speak as though you know something of the matter, Your Grace." "I know only what you have told me," Julian said, though the lie sat uneasily on his tongue. She studied him a moment longer before letting the subject drop, though Julian could not shake the sense that her suspicion had not fully dissolved, merely settled into some quiet corner of her mind where it would wait, patiently, for further evidence. That evidence arrived sooner than he expected. 3 days later, Eleanor's solicitor, a careful and thorough man her father had employed for many years, discovered the true source of the payment through routine correspondence with the bank, and brought the information directly to Eleanor rather than her father, sensing perhaps that she deserved to know before anyone else did. Eleanor arrived at Julian's townhouse that same afternoon, her expression carrying an intensity he had not seen from her before, something between gratitude and anger that made him brace himself before she had even spoken a word. "You paid our debt," she said, the moment his housekeeper had shown her into his study and left them alone. "You told me you knew nothing of the matter, and yet it was you all along." Julian set down the papers he had been reviewing, meeting her eyes directly. "I did not want you to feel obligated to me, or ashamed to accept help. I thought it kinder to let the gesture remain anonymous." "Kinder?" Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, though whether from anger or something closer to overwhelming emotion, Julian could not immediately determine. "You lied to me, Julian, directly, to my face, when I asked you outright whether you knew anything of the matter." "I did not want to lie," Julian said, "but I did not want you to refuse the help either, out of pride, when your father's well-being depended on it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though holding something fragile together. "Do you understand what it means, for a woman in my position, to accept such a gift from a man she is not married to? What people will say, if they learn of it?" "I would be ruined, Julian, entirely ruined, and my father's reputation along with mine." "No one will learn of it," Julian said firmly. "I made certain of that, through my solicitor. The payment appears entirely anonymous, with no trace leading back to me." "And if it did?" Eleanor pressed. "If someone discovered the truth, as my own solicitor discovered it, what then?" Julian had no answer for that, and his silence seemed to confirm every fear gathering in Eleanor's expression. "I appreciate what you tried to do," she said finally, her voice softer now, though still carrying an edge of hurt. "I understand you meant it kindly, and I know my father's health depended on that debt being settled. But I cannot accept charity from you, Julian, not without understanding exactly what it means for both of us, and not without being given the choice to accept or refuse it myself." "I am sorry," Julian said, and he meant it, though the apology felt inadequate against the weight of what he had done. "I should have spoken with you first, rather than deciding on your behalf. I have grown so accustomed to solving problems privately, without consulting anyone, that I forgot you deserved a voice in the matter." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, though the hurt had not entirely faded. "I do not doubt your intentions were good, but good intentions do not erase the fact that you made a decision about my life, my family, without asking whether I wanted your help in that particular way." "What can I do to make this right?" Julian asked. "Nothing, for now," Eleanor said. "The debt is paid, and I cannot undo that, nor would I wish to, given how much it has helped my father. I only ask that you never again make such decisions without speaking to me first. If we are to remain friends, Julian, I need to trust that you see me as an equal partner in whatever concerns us both, not someone to be managed and protected from the truth." "You have my word," Julian said quietly. "Whatever comes next, I will not hide the truth from you again." Eleanor nodded slowly, though the tension between them did not fully dissolve, lingering in the careful distance she maintained as she took her leave that afternoon. Julian watched her carriage disappear down the street, a familiar ache settling in his chest, the fear that he had damaged something delicate and important through his own stubborn insistence on solving problems alone. Over the following days, their visits continued, though something had shifted between them, a careful wariness that had not existed before. Eleanor remained polite, even warm at times, but Julian sensed a new guardedness in her manner, as though she were testing whether his promise of honesty would truly hold. He found himself wondering, during the quiet hours of the evening, whether his fear of vulnerability had led him not toward the connection he desperately wanted, but toward the very deception he had promised himself he would never again participate in. He had spent 2 years protecting himself from betrayal, only to discover that in trying to protect Eleanor from her own pride, he had betrayed her trust in a smaller but equally painful way. Her father's health, meanwhile, continued its uncertain course, some days bringing genuine improvement, others bringing setbacks that left Eleanor exhausted and worried late into the night. Julian offered what support he could, careful now to ask before acting, to consult Eleanor on every decision that touched her family's welfare, however small. Slowly, gradually, the careful distance between them began to soften once more, replaced by the same easy warmth that had characterized their earliest conversations. Eleanor found herself trusting him again, piece by piece, and Julian found himself grateful beyond measure for a second chance he was not entirely certain he deserved. Charlotte noticed the shift in her cousin's mood almost immediately. and cornered Eleanor one afternoon while they sorted through fabric samples for a dress Eleanor could not truly afford but had promised herself as a small comfort after weeks of worry. "You have been quiet since your visit to the Duke's townhouse," Charlotte said, holding a length of green silk up to the light. "Did something happen between you?" "He paid off Father's debt without telling me," Eleanor admitted, running her fingers absently along the edge of a swatch of blue muslin. "I only learned the truth by accident, through our solicitor." Charlotte's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That is rather a large secret to keep, even from someone he cares for as deeply as he clearly cares for you." "That is precisely what troubles me," Eleanor said. "It is not the money itself. I am grateful beyond words for what it has meant for Father's health. It is the deception, the way he decided on my behalf without giving me any voice in the matter, as though my pride and my choices mattered less than his own comfort in solving the problem quietly." "Men of his station are not accustomed to asking permission," Charlotte said gently, "especially men who have spent years managing estates and fortunes without anyone questioning their decisions." "Then he shall have to grow accustomed to it, if he wishes to remain close to me," Eleanor said, though her tone carried more sadness than anger now. "I cannot build anything lasting with a man who hides the truth from me, however good his reasons may seem at the time." Charlotte set down the fabric and took her cousin's hand. "Do you still care for him, despite all this?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Yes, far more than I expected to, and far more than is probably wise, given everything Aunt Margaret has warned me about. But caring for someone does not mean overlooking every mistake they make, Charlotte. It means asking them to do better, and hoping they are willing to try." "That sounds like wisdom beyond your years," Charlotte said, smiling softly. "Or simple necessity," Eleanor replied. "I have very little patience left for pretending everything is fine when it is not. Perhaps that is the one advantage of everything we have endured these past months. It has taught me to demand honesty, even when it would be easier to accept comfortable silence instead." During this same period, Julian found himself increasingly aware of Lord Callahan's growing interest in his affairs, an interest that had shifted from idle curiosity into something sharper, more calculating. They encountered each other at a private card game one evening, hosted by a mutual acquaintance, and Callahan wasted little time in raising the subject that had clearly occupied his thoughts. "You have been rather occupied lately, Rothmere," Callahan said, shuffling the deck with deliberate slowness. "Word has it you visit Miss Whitfield's home with remarkable regularity, some might say obsessive regularity." "My affairs are my own concern," Julian said evenly, though he felt his guard rising instinctively. Of course. Callahan's smile carried the same false warmth Julian had grown accustomed to distrusting. "Though I confess, I find myself curious what a woman in her position hopes to gain from such attentions. Her family circumstances are hardly a secret after all." "Eleanor wants nothing from me beyond friendship," Julian said, his voice hardening. "I would advise you to choose your next words carefully, Callahan." "Forgive me, I meant no offense." Callahan raised his hands in mock surrender, though the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. "I only find it curious, is all, that a man so famously guarded against fortune hunters has grown so remarkably trusting of one particular young lady. One does wonder what makes her so different from all the others who have tried and failed to capture your attention these past 2 years." Julian said nothing, refusing to give Callahan the satisfaction of a reaction, though the exchange left him unsettled long after the card game had ended. He recognized, even then, the particular danger in a man like Callahan taking such pointed interest in his private affairs, though he could not yet guess how far that interest would eventually travel, nor how much damage it would ultimately cause. He mentioned nothing of the conversation to Eleanor, unwilling to burden her with suspicions he could not yet prove, though he found himself watching Callahan more carefully at every subsequent gathering, alert to any sign of the man's growing resentment. It was not until several weeks later, during a quiet evening at the theater, that Julian understood the true depth of Callahan's envy. He caught the man watching Eleanor from across the crowded lobby during intermission, his expression carrying none of its usual practiced charm, replaced instead by something colder, more calculating, the look of a man already plotting his next move. Julian said nothing that evening, choosing instead to guide Eleanor gently away from Callahan's line of sight, though the unease that had settled in his chest refused to fully dissipate. He told himself he was being overly cautious, that Callahan's envy, however genuine, posed little real threat to the fragile trust he had rebuilt with Eleanor over these past difficult weeks. But neither of them could have anticipated how quickly that fragile trust would be tested again, nor how much more painful the next challenge would prove to be. The rumor began, as most damaging rumors do, in a quiet corner of a crowded room, spoken softly enough to seem harmless, cruel enough to spread like fire through dry grass. Eleanor first heard whispers of it during a morning call to Charlotte's home, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned, with barely concealed delight, that half the ton was discussing a letter supposedly written by Eleanor herself, describing in calculating detail her plans to secure the Duke of Rothmere's fortune through careful manipulation of his loneliness and his guilt over his father's death. "It is nonsense," Charlotte said firmly, the moment the acquaintance had departed. "No one who knows you would believe such a thing." "Half of London does not know me," Eleanor said, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her teacup. "They know only what they are told, and apparently what they are being told is that I am nothing more than a fortune hunter who has been scheming since the night we met." The rumor grew more elaborate with each passing day, details added and embellished until it bore little resemblance to anything resembling truth. Eleanor was accused of forging affection to manipulate a grieving man, of orchestrating the debt payment herself through clever manipulation, rather than accepting it as an unexpected act of kindness, of boasting privately to friends about the wealth and status she intended to secure through marriage. None of it was true. But truth, Eleanor was learning with painful clarity, mattered very little once a rumor gained sufficient momentum among people eager for scandal. She did not learn the source of the rumor until several days later, when her aunt returned from an afternoon visit with troubling news. "It was Lord Callahan," Margaret said, her expression grim. "He has been telling the story at every gathering he attends, claiming he overheard you discussing your intentions with your cousin at a private dinner weeks ago. Several people claim to have heard him repeat it nearly word for word." "That is a lie," Eleanor said, anger finally breaking through the numbness that had settled over her these past days. "I have never spoken such words to anyone, least of all Charlotte." "I believe you," her aunt said gently. "But belief matters little when an entire season's worth of society has already decided the story sounds plausible enough to repeat." Eleanor sent word to Julian immediately, hoping he would understand the falseness of the accusation without hesitation, hoping their weeks of honest conversation had built enough trust to withstand even this vicious attack. But when Julian arrived at her home that evening, his expression carried none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to, replaced instead by something guarded and distant that made her stomach drop with dread. "You have heard the rumors," she said, before he had even fully entered the parlor. "I have," Julian said, his voice carefully controlled. "Callahan approached me directly this afternoon, quite eager to share every detail, including a supposed witness who claims to have overheard your conversation firsthand. It is not true, Julian. None of it is true. I have never spoken of your fortune or your title with anything but indifference, and you know that better than anyone." "Do I?" Julian's question landed like a blow, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the doubt she heard beneath it. "Forgive me, Eleanor, but I have been deceived before, by someone who seemed equally sincere, equally devoted to honesty, right up until the moment her true intentions were revealed." "I am not her," Eleanor said, her voice rising despite her effort to remain calm. "I have never asked you for anything, Julian, not your title, not your fortune, not even your protection, though you have offered it freely regardless. How can you stand there and compare me to a woman who deceived you, when everything I have ever told you has been the plain, unflattering truth?" Julian said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying a conflict Eleanor could see but could not fully understand. "I want to believe you," he finally said, "but the doubt Callahan planted has proven difficult to dismiss entirely, however much I wish it were otherwise." The words cut deeper than any cruelty Lady Priscilla had offered at the garden party, deeper than any whispered gossip Eleanor had endured over 3 difficult seasons. To be doubted by strangers was painful. To be doubted by the one person she had trusted enough to be entirely honest with felt like a wound she was not certain would ever fully heal. "Then perhaps you should take your leave," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the edges of her composure. "Until you are certain what you believe, I do not think there is anything more to say between us." Julian hesitated at the door, something in his expression suggesting he wanted to argue, to close the distance and take back the doubt he had voiced. But whatever battle raged within him, he said nothing further, and left without another word, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that felt far heavier than the sound itself. The following weeks proved among the most difficult Eleanor had ever endured. Invitations that had once arrived regularly ceased entirely. Acquaintances who had begun to warm toward her in recent months returned to their previous cold indifference. Or worse, active cruelty disguised as polite conversation. She attended one final gathering, a dinner hosted by a family friend who had not yet abandoned her entirely, and endured an evening of pointed glances and half-whispered comments that left her exhausted and humiliated by the time she finally returned home. Through it all, she refused to defend herself loudly or publicly, refused to beg anyone, including Julian, to believe in her innocence. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not lower herself to groveling for the good opinion of people who had judged her so quickly and so unfairly. "You are stronger than I would be, in your position," Charlotte said one evening, finding Eleanor sitting quietly by the window, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. "I do not know how you endure it with such composure." "I am not as composed as I appear," Eleanor admitted. "I simply refuse to give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. Whatever they believe, I know the truth of my own heart, and that will have to be enough, even if no one else ever believes it." Meanwhile, Julian found himself increasingly troubled by the doubt he had allowed to take root, unable to reconcile the calculating woman Callahan described with the Eleanor he had come to know so intimately over these past months. He began, quietly and without her knowledge, to investigate the source of Callahan's claims, questioning the supposed witness who had allegedly overheard Eleanor's damning conversation. The witness, when finally located, proved to be a young footman recently dismissed from Charlotte's household staff, a man with clear financial motivation to accept payment for testimony that suited Callahan's purposes. Under careful questioning, and the promise of continued discretion regarding his own dismissal, the footman eventually admitted that he had never overheard any such conversation at all, that Callahan had approached him directly with the story already formed, offering payment in exchange for corroboration. Julian felt something cold settle in his chest as the full scope of Callahan's deception became clear. He thought of Eleanor's steady voice as she denied the accusations, of the hurt in her eyes when he had failed to immediately trust her, and he understood, with sudden and painful clarity, exactly how badly he had failed the one person who had never given him any reason for doubt. He confronted Callahan directly at his own club, demanding an explanation before several witnesses who happened to be present. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you hope to gain by destroying an innocent woman's reputation with lies?" Callahan's composure cracked slightly under the weight of Julian's fury, though he attempted, briefly, to maintain his usual practiced calm. "I merely thought you deserved to know the truth about a woman clearly angling for your fortune." "You knew there was no truth to know," Julian said. "You invented the entire story, paid a dismissed servant to corroborate it, and spread it through every drawing room in London out of nothing more than petty jealousy. I have seen the way you look at her, Callahan. This was never about protecting me. This was about punishing her for choosing my company over yours." The accusation landed with visible force, and several of the gathered witnesses exchanged knowing glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to open disapproval as the truth of Callahan's motives became clear. "Whatever my reasons," Callahan said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "the damage has already been done. Her reputation cannot simply be repaired by your sudden change of heart, Rothmere." Julian said nothing further, though the truth of Callahan's final words settled heavily in his chest as he left the club that evening. Eleanor's reputation had suffered real and lasting damage that his own doubt had only worsened by lending credibility to Callahan's lies in the eyes of society. Knowing the truth was one thing, undoing the harm already caused was an entirely different and far more difficult matter. Before leaving the club, Julian sought out the dismissed footman once more, this time offering him steady employment at one of his own properties in exchange for a written statement detailing exactly how Callahan had approached him, what payment had been offered, and what precise falsehoods he had been coached to repeat. The young man agreed readily, visibly relieved to unburden himself of the guilt he had clearly been carrying since accepting Callahan's bribe. With the written statement secured, Julian began quietly gathering additional evidence, calling upon two other guests who had been present at the private dinner Callahan claimed as the source of his information. Both confirmed, without hesitation, that no such conversation had ever taken place, that Eleanor had spoken of nothing beyond ordinary pleasantries throughout the entire evening. Piece by piece, the fabricated story began to unravel under the weight of contradicting testimony, each new account further confirming what Julian had already come to believe in his heart, however late that belief had arrived. He returned home that night more determined than he had felt in years, understanding clearly that half measures would not be sufficient to repair what his hesitation had broken. Whatever it cost him, whatever public scrutiny he would need to endure, he intended to make certain that Eleanor's name was cleared as thoroughly and as publicly as it had been damaged. But first, he knew, he owed her something far more important than a public defense. He owed her an apology, honest and complete. For the moment his own fear had outweighed his trust in her, however briefly that failure had lasted. While Julian wrestled with his own guilt, Eleanor faced a quieter but no less painful battle at home. Her father, weakened already by months of illness, had grown increasingly distressed upon learning of the rumors circulating through society. worried more for his daughter's future than for his own failing health. "I should never have encouraged your friendship with him," he said one evening, his voice frail but insistent, as Eleanor helped him settle against his pillows. "I saw how happy he made you, and I let that happiness blind me to the risks such a friendship carried for a woman in your position." "You did nothing wrong, father," Eleanor said firmly, smoothing the blanket over his lap with practiced care. "The fault lies entirely with Lord Callahan, and perhaps with my own foolish hope that society might judge me by my character rather than my circumstances." "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Knowing him, caring for him, even now, with everything it has cost you?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer empty reassurance when her father deserved nothing less than complete honesty. "Some days, yes, I regret how much it has cost us both. But I do not regret knowing him, father. Whatever comes next, I learned something valuable these past months, about my own strength, and about what honesty truly looks like when it is finally offered without pretense. That knowledge feels worth the pain, even now." Her father squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes bright with something between pride and sorrow. "You have always been stronger than you realize, my dear. Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become, regardless of what society chooses to believe about you." The days that followed brought little relief from the weight of public scrutiny. Eleanor ventured out only when necessary, avoiding the parks and shops she had once visited freely, wary of the pointed stares and hushed conversations that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Charlotte remained a steady presence throughout, refusing to abandon her cousin despite the social cost of maintaining such loyalty during a scandal. "You need not defend me at every gathering," Eleanor told her one afternoon, noting the exhaustion evident in Charlotte's usually cheerful expression. "I would understand if you thought it wiser to distance yourself, at least until the rumors fade." "I would never abandon you over something so plainly false," Charlotte said, indignant at the very suggestion. "What kind of cousin, what kind of friend, would I be if I allowed gossip to dictate my loyalty? Let them whisper. I know the truth, and so does anyone who has truly taken the time to know you." Still, despite Charlotte's unwavering support, Eleanor could not deny the toll the isolation was taking on her spirit. She had spent years learning to navigate society's quiet dismissal, its habit of overlooking women without fortune or particular beauty. But this was different, a targeted cruelty that followed her into every remaining corner of her small world. She thought often of Julian during those difficult days, replaying their final conversation over and over, searching for some way she might have proven her innocence more convincingly, some words she might have chosen that would have prevented the doubt from ever taking root in his expression. But each time she reached the same conclusion. She had told him only the truth, plainly and without embellishment, and if that truth had not been sufficient to withstand Callahan's calculated lies, then perhaps the foundation they had built together had never been as solid as she believed. And yet, beneath the hurt and the exhaustion, a smaller, quieter hope remained, one she tried repeatedly to extinguish without success. She remembered the honesty in his voice beneath the oak tree, the vulnerability he had shown her when admitting his fear of trusting again. Surely, she told herself, a man capable of such honesty would eventually recognize the truth, however long it took him to see past Callahan's carefully constructed deception. She did not know, during those long and difficult days, that Julian was already working tirelessly to uncover that very truth, questioning witnesses, tracing the origins of every whispered accusation, determined to repair the damage his own doubt had helped to cause. She knew only the silence that had stretched between them since his departure from her parlor, a silence that felt, some nights, as though it might never be broken. The question that troubled him most, as he sat alone in his study long into the night, was whether Eleanor would be willing to forgive him at all, after everything her pride and her heart had already endured. The invitation arrived at the Whitfield home 3 days later, sealed with the Rothmere crest, requesting Eleanor's presence at a gathering hosted by Julian himself, an event unlike any he had ever held before, given his usual preference for avoiding society's larger gatherings entirely. Eleanor stared at the invitation for a long moment, uncertain whether to accept, torn between the hurt that still lingered from their final conversation and the small, persistent hope she had never quite managed to extinguish. "You should go," her father said, when she showed him the invitation later that evening. "Whatever happened between you, I do not believe a man capable of such gentleness would summon you now without good reason." "And if his reason is simply to publicly confirm what everyone already believes?" Eleanor asked, voicing the fear she had carried since the invitation arrived. "I do not think I could bear that kind of humiliation, father, not after everything these past weeks have already cost us." "I do not believe that is his intention," her father said gently. "But you must decide for yourself, my dear. Whatever you choose, know that I will support you completely, either way. After much deliberation and a lengthy conversation with Charlotte that offered little clarity but considerable comfort, Eleanor decided to attend, dressing carefully in her best remaining gown, a deep green that had once belonged to her mother, altered slightly to fit her own frame. Whatever awaited her at Julian's townhouse, she intended to face it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment of these past painful weeks. The townhouse was already crowded when her carriage arrived, far more guests present than she had expected for what she assumed would be a modest gathering. She recognized many faces from the season's various balls and dinners, including several who had participated eagerly in spreading the rumors that had so thoroughly damaged her reputation. Her stomach tightened with apprehension as she stepped through the entrance, uncertain what awaited her inside. Julian found her almost immediately, cutting through the crowd with a purposeful stride that drew curious glances from the assembled guests. He looked, Eleanor thought, more nervous than she had ever seen him, his usual composed bearing replaced by something raw and uncertain. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, once he had reached her side. "I was not entirely certain you would." "I was not entirely certain myself," Eleanor admitted. "What is this gathering, Julian? Why have you summoned half of London to your home?" "You will see," he said. "Will you trust me, one more time, despite everything?" Eleanor studied his face, searching for some sign of what he intended, and found only earnest determination, the same honesty she had come to recognize as genuinely his own. "I will trust you," she said finally, "this once more." He led her toward the center of the great room, where a small platform had been arranged, and as they approached, the assembled guests gradually quieted, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Lord Callahan stood near the edge of the crowd, his expression carrying visible unease as he realized, perhaps, exactly what Julian intended. "Thank you all for coming this evening," Julian began, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "I have gathered you here for a purpose I do not take lightly. Several weeks ago, a rumor began circulating through society, accusing Miss Eleanor Whitfield of scheming and deception, of manipulating my affections for the sake of fortune and title." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the sudden weight of every gathered gaze, though she forced herself to remain standing tall beside him, refusing to shrink from the attention. "That rumor was a complete fabrication," Julian continued, "invented and spread by Lord Callahan, who bribed a dismissed servant to corroborate a conversation that never took place. I have written statements confirming this deception, along with testimony from witnesses who were present at the dinner Callahan falsely claimed as his source." Callahan's face had drained of color entirely, and several guests near him took a visible step backward, distancing themselves from the growing scandal now attached to his name. "I made a grave error," Julian continued, turning now to address Eleanor directly, though his words carried clearly to every corner of the room. "When Callahan first brought these lies to me, I allowed old wounds and old fears to cloud my judgment. I doubted a woman who had given me nothing but honesty since the very night we met, a woman who has never once asked anything of me beyond simple friendship and genuine understanding." Eleanor's breath caught as Julian reached for her hand, his grip steady despite the visible emotion in his expression. "Eleanor Whitfield asked to be ignored, the very first night we met, because I told her, rudely and without cause, that ignoring me was the wisest course anyone in that room could take. Instead, she smiled, and walked away exactly as I asked, without any attempt to flatter me or curry favor, without any interest in my title or my fortune. In the months since, she has shown me nothing but the same unwavering honesty, even when that honesty cost her comfort, even when it would have been easier to simply tell me what I wanted to hear." He turned back to face the crowd, his voice growing firmer, more certain. "I failed her, briefly, when doubt clouded my judgment. But I will not fail her again. Let it be known, to everyone gathered here and to everyone who has repeated Callahan's poisonous lies these past weeks, that Eleanor Whitfield's character is beyond reproach, and that any further attempt to damage her reputation will be met with my complete and unwavering opposition." The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over the assembled guests, before a low murmur of conversation began to spread, this one carrying a distinctly different tone than the whispers of previous weeks. Julian turned to Eleanor then, releasing her hand only to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made her breath catch entirely. "I know this is not how such moments are usually arranged," he said, his voice softer now, meant for her alone despite the crowd surrounding them. "I have no grand speech prepared, no carefully chosen words to convince you of feelings I suspect you already understand. I love you, Eleanor, not for your fortune, since you have none to offer, and not for your title, since you hold none to bestow. I love you for your honesty, your strength, and your remarkable ability to see through every wall I have spent years building around myself." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, far less ostentatious than Eleanor might have expected from a man of his station, and somehow all the more meaningful for its simplicity. "I cannot promise I will never make mistakes again," he continued. "I have already proven, painfully, that I am capable of doubt, of fear, of choosing caution over trust when it mattered most. But I can promise that I will never again let you feel ignored, unseen, or unheard, not for as long as I have breath to correct such failures. Will you marry me, Eleanor, and allow me to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the trust you have so generously offered me?" Eleanor felt tears gathering, unbidden, as she looked at the man before her. No longer the cold and guarded Duke she had first encountered at that crowded ball, but someone entirely different, someone who had chosen, deliberately and publicly, to be vulnerable in front of everyone who had ever doubted either of them. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the emotion thickening it. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." The room erupted into applause, some guests genuinely delighted by the unexpected romance unfolding before them, others simply relieved to witness such definitive resolution to weeks of scandalous speculation. Julian slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and when he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, Eleanor felt every remaining doubt and fear finally begin to dissolve. Lord Callahan had already slipped from the room sometime during Julian's declaration, his reputation among their shared circle of acquaintances irreparably damaged by the public revelation of his deception. Eleanor found she felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that the truth had finally been established beyond any reasonable doubt. Charlotte appeared at her side moments later, embracing her tightly, tears of genuine joy streaming down her face. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you he was not like the others." "You did," Eleanor agreed, laughing softly despite her own tears. "Though I confess I never expected quite so dramatic a resolution to our troubles." Later that evening, once most of the guests had finally departed and only Charlotte and a few close friends remained, Julian found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor near the same terrace where they had first properly met, all those months ago at Lord Averley's garden party. "Do you remember what I told you, the very first night we met?" Julian asked, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders as they looked out over the darkened garden. "You told me to ignore you," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory, "like everyone else did. And instead you smiled," Julian said. "I have thought of that smile every day since, though I did not understand, at the time, exactly how thoroughly it would change the course of my life." "I did not understand it either," Eleanor admitted. "I only knew that beneath all your sharpness, there was something worth noticing, something that deserved more than simple dismissal. I am grateful, every single day, that you refused to grant my request," Julian said softly. "Ignoring me would have been so much easier for you, given everything that request has since cost you. And yet you chose kindness instead, even when I gave you every reason not to." "I do not regret it," Eleanor said, leaning into his embrace. "Not for a single moment, despite everything these past months have cost us both." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge slowly across the night sky, no longer the invisible wallflower and the guarded, ice-cold Duke that society had once dismissed and feared in equal measure, but two people who had found, against every expectation and every obstacle placed before them, exactly the kind of honest and enduring love neither had believed themselves capable of finding. In the weeks that followed the engagement announcement, society's opinion of Eleanor shifted with a speed that might have seemed comical had it not been so infuriating. Women who had once whispered cruelly behind their fans now sought her company at every gathering, eager to claim friendship with the woman who had captured the notoriously guarded Duke of Rothmere's heart. Eleanor accepted this sudden reversal with quiet amusement rather than bitterness, though she made certain to remain closest to those who had shown her genuine loyalty during the difficult weeks of scandal, particularly Charlotte, whose steadfast support she would never forget. Her father's health, buoyed perhaps by relief and happiness as much as by continued medical care, showed gradual but genuine improvement in the months following the engagement. Julian insisted on bringing in physicians from the finest hospitals in London, and though he was careful now to discuss every decision with Eleanor first, honoring the promise he had made after the painful lesson of the anonymous debt payment, her father's care improved steadily under this combined attention. "You did not need to involve yourself so completely in my father's welfare," Eleanor told him one afternoon, watching Julian discuss treatment options with a specialist he had personally arranged to visit their home. "He will be my father as well, soon enough," Julian said simply. "I find I rather like the idea of having family again, After so many years of feeling entirely alone in that grand house of mine. Eleanor squeezed his hand, understanding completely the quiet loneliness that had shaped so much of his guarded nature before they had met. You will never be alone again, Julian. Whatever else changes, I promise you that much. Lord Callahan, meanwhile, found himself increasingly unwelcome in the circles he had once moved through with such confident ease. His attempt to destroy Eleanor's reputation through calculated deception had instead destroyed his own standing among people who valued honesty and loyalty above petty jealousy. He eventually withdrew from London society entirely, retreating to a distant family property in the countryside, his absence noted by few, and mourned by fewer still. Eleanor thought of him only rarely in the months that followed, finding she held no particular anger toward him beyond simple relief that his deception had ultimately failed. She had learned, through the painful experience of those difficult weeks, exactly how strong she could be when tested, and exactly how much her own character mattered more than the fickle opinions of people who judged so quickly and so unfairly. Their wedding, when it finally took place several months later, was a modest affair by the standards of dukes and their brides, held in the small country chapel near Julian's estate rather than the grand cathedral society might have expected. Eleanor's father, though still frail, insisted on walking her down the narrow aisle himself, his pride evident in every careful step, and Charlotte stood as her only attendant, beaming with happiness throughout the entire ceremony, as Julian slipped a second ring onto her finger, sealing their vows before family and the small circle of true friends who had remained loyal throughout every difficulty. Eleanor found herself thinking once more of that first cold night at the crowded ball, of a rude stranger who had demanded to be ignored, and a woman who had chosen, instead, to see him fully. After the ceremony, as the small gathering of guests moved outside into the golden afternoon light for a modest celebration beneath the chapel's ancient oak trees, Eleanor found a quiet moment to stand beside her father, who watched the festivities with tears of unmistakable pride glistening in his eyes. "Your mother would have loved him," he said softly, watching Julian across the lawn, laughing at something Charlotte had said, his guarded reserve entirely absent in a way Eleanor still found remarkable to witness. Not for his title, mind you, she never cared for such things. She would have loved him for the way he looks at you, as though you are the answer to a question he had stopped believing anyone could answer. "I think she would have liked that he learned to trust again," Eleanor said, resting her head briefly against her father's shoulder. "It was not an easy thing for him, after everything he had endured. Trust rarely comes easily to anyone who has been wounded by it before," her father said. "But you gave him reason to try, my dear, simply by being exactly who you are, without pretense or calculation. That is no small gift to offer another person." Julian joined them a moment later, slipping his arm around Eleanor's waist with the easy familiarity of a man who no longer feared showing affection openly, regardless of who might be watching. "Am I interrupting something important?" "Only a father's pride in his daughter," Eleanor's father said, smiling warmly. "Take care of her, Julian. She has weathered more difficulty than most women twice her age, and she has done so with more grace than I ever taught her." "I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that," Julian said, and Eleanor did not doubt, watching the steady certainty in his expression, that he meant every word completely. As the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long golden shadows across the chapel lawn, Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to simply exist within the happiness she had once believed impossible for a woman in her circumstances. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever adjustments would be required as she learned to navigate life as a duchess rather than an overlooked wallflower, she faced the future now without fear, secure in the knowledge that she had found, in Julian, someone who saw her completely and loved her precisely because of that complete honesty, rather than in spite of it. Neither of them, she thought, watching Julian's face soften into the rare and genuine smile she had come to treasure above all else, would ever again feel unseen or unheard, not while they continued choosing each other, honestly and completely, for every remaining day of their lives together. A year had passed since Eleanor became Duchess of Rothmere, and the grand house that had once echoed with silence now carried the constant sound of laughter, of visiting friends, of a household finally alive with warmth Julian had not believed possible when he first inherited its cold, empty halls. Eleanor stood in the same study where Julian had once sat alone night after night, staring at his father's portrait and wondering whether love could ever be trusted again. Now she watched him from the doorway, bent over papers concerning a new charitable foundation they had established together, one dedicated to assisting families facing the same desperate circumstances hers had once endured. "You are working too late again," she said, crossing the room to rest her hands on his shoulders. "I could say the same of you," Julian replied, tilting his head back to look up at her, the affection in his eyes as steady now as it had been unfamiliar to him a year before. "You spent the entire afternoon visiting the almshouse. Someone must ensure the funds are properly used," Eleanor said, though her smile suggested she needed little excuse to continue the work that had become so meaningful to her since their marriage. "Besides, I enjoy it. There is something satisfying in knowing our fortune helps families who once felt as invisible as I did, before you walked into that ballroom and demanded I ignore you." "A demand you famously refused," Julian said, setting down his pen to take her hand. "The best decision I ever made," Eleanor agreed, settling into the chair beside his desk. Her father had continued to improve steadily throughout the year, strong enough now to travel occasionally to visit them at the estate, where he spent long afternoons in the gardens with his grandchild on the way, a fact that filled Eleanor with a happiness she had never dared imagine during those darkest weeks of scandal and doubt. Charlotte had married soon after Eleanor's own wedding, choosing a quiet, kind gentleman who valued her wit and loyalty above fashion or fortune, and the two cousins remained as close as ever, visiting frequently and exchanging letters filled with news both trivial and important. Lord Callahan's name rarely surfaced in conversation anymore, his reputation never fully recovering from the public exposure of his deception. Occasionally Eleanor heard whispers of his continued isolation in the countryside, and though she felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, she recognized it as a fitting consequence for the cruelty he had chosen to inflict on someone who had never wronged him. Julian, for his part, had continued the slow process of allowing himself genuine vulnerability, not only with Eleanor but with the small circle of trusted friends who had remained loyal throughout their difficulties. He no longer carried himself with the same guarded coldness that had defined him at their first meeting, replaced instead by a quiet confidence that came from finally trusting someone completely, without reservation or fear. "Do you ever think about that night?" Eleanor asked one evening, as they walked together through the gardens where Julian had first admitted his growing feelings, all those months ago beneath the same oak tree that still stood at the center of the estate's grounds. "Which night?" Julian asked, though the small smile playing at his lips suggested he already knew exactly which memory she meant. "The ball. When you told me to ignore you." "Constantly," Julian admitted. "I think of it every time someone new enters our lives, every time I catch myself building walls out of old habit, before remembering that vulnerability with you has only ever brought me happiness, not the betrayal I once feared." "I am glad I did not listen to you," Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder as they continued their slow walk beneath the darkening sky. "As am I," Julian said, "though I confess, at the time, your refusal to obey my rather rude demand struck me as the most infuriating thing that had happened to me in years. And now I consider it the single most fortunate moment of my entire life," Julian said, stopping beneath the oak tree to face her directly, taking both her hands in his own. "You saw something in me that night that I did not believe existed anymore, something worth noticing beneath all my carefully constructed coldness. I do not think I will ever be able to properly thank you for that gift, however long we remain together." Eleanor smiled up at him, thinking of everything they had endured to reach this quiet, peaceful moment, the rumors and doubt and painful separation that had once threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Yet here they stood, stronger for having weathered that difficulty, their bond deepened rather than broken by the trials they had faced. "You do not need to thank me," she said softly. "You only need to keep choosing this, choosing us, the way you have every single day since that garden party when you finally trusted me completely. That is thanks enough. Then I shall spend every remaining day of my life doing exactly that," Julian said, drawing her close as the first stars began to emerge above the darkening garden. Word of their story spread quietly through society over that first year, not through cruel gossip as it once had, but through genuine admiration for a couple who had faced scandal and doubt and emerged stronger for having weathered it honestly. Young women who had once dismissed Eleanor as unworthy of notice now sought her friendship and advice, curious how a woman with so little fortune had captured the heart of London's most guarded duke. Eleanor always answered the same way, with a patient smile that carried none of the bitterness she might once have felt toward those who had judged her so unfairly. "I did nothing extraordinary," she would tell them. "I simply refused to pretend to be someone I was not, even when pretending might have been easier. Honesty is rarely comfortable, but it is always worth the difficulty it costs." Julian, too, found himself approached more frequently by young gentlemen of his acquaintance, curious how a man so famously resistant to romance had allowed himself to be so thoroughly transformed. He offered similar advice, though delivered with his characteristic dry humor rather than Eleanor's gentle patience. "Find someone who tells you the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient," he would say. Everything else follows naturally from that single foundation. In the months that followed, their happiness continued to grow, deepened further by the arrival of their first child, a daughter with her mother's steady gaze and, according to the household staff who whispered about it fondly, her father's stubborn determination even from her earliest days. Julian doted on her completely, spending hours in the nursery despite the many demands of managing his estate, determined that his daughter would never doubt, for even a single moment, how deeply she was loved and how thoroughly she was seen. Eleanor watched him during these quiet moments, remembering the guarded, distant man she had first encountered at that crowded ball, and marveled at how completely he had transformed, not into someone entirely different, but into a fuller, more honest version of the man he had always been beneath his careful defenses. Her own father lived long enough to see his granddaughter's first birthday, a milestone that brought the entire family together in joyful celebration at the estate, before his health finally declined in the natural course of time, surrounded by love rather than the desperate worry that had once defined his final years. Eleanor grieved his passing deeply, but found comfort in knowing he had lived to see her truly happy, secure in a marriage built on honesty rather than mere necessity. Charlotte remained a constant presence throughout every season of their lives, her own family growing alongside Eleanor's, the two cousins raising their children together with the same closeness that had sustained them both through difficult years. Their friendship, forged in childhood and tested through scandal and hardship, remained one of the steadiest foundations of Eleanor's happiness. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor and Julian's household became known throughout society, not for scandal or gossip, but for genuine warmth and hospitality, a place where honest conversation was valued far above careful performance, where guests found themselves speaking more freely than they did in any other grand house they visited. Julian's reputation for coldness faded entirely, replaced by admiration for a man who had learned, through genuine hardship, the true value of trust and vulnerability. Eleanor never forgot the woman she had once been, standing invisible near the windows of countless ballrooms, overlooked and dismissed by a society that valued fortune and beauty above character and honesty. She carried that memory with her always, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the perspective it had given her, the understanding that true worth had nothing to do with wealth or station, and everything to do with the courage to remain genuine even when the world offered every reason to hide. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and their daughter slept peacefully in the nursery upstairs, Eleanor and Julian often returned to the garden beneath the old oak tree, sitting together in comfortable silence, grateful for everything their difficult beginning had ultimately given them. "Ignore me like everyone else," Julian said once, laughing softly at the memory, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge above the peaceful grounds of their shared home. "I cannot believe I once said something so foolish to the woman who would become my entire world." "I am glad you did," Eleanor said, resting her head against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "If you had not said it, I might never have smiled, and you might never have noticed. Sometimes, Julian, the smallest moments carry the greatest consequences, if only we are brave enough to see them clearly." And there, beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed the quiet beginning of their unlikely love, surrounded by the peaceful grounds of the home they had built together through honesty, courage, and hard-won trust, Eleanor Whitfield, once dismissed as invisible by an entire season of indifferent society, found herself completely and permanently seen, cherished not despite her circumstances, but for the unwavering honesty and quiet strength that had defined her through every difficult trial along the way. Their story, whispered eventually through generations of their family, became a quiet reminder that even the coldest hearts could be warmed by genuine kindness, and that even the most overlooked among us carried within them the strength to change everything, simply by choosing honesty over silence, and courage over fear, when it mattered most.